Welcome to Leading Organizations That Matter, a podcast about leadership, organizational culture, and how we find meaning and purpose in our work. I'm your host, Ray Spadoni, and today's topic is when bad things happen to good and bad organizations. An interview with Bob Griffin. This podcast has given me an opportunity to meet many great people, individuals who are experts and who've gained interesting insights from their years of work dedicated to a cause or helping organizations that matter. But sometimes I have an opportunity to speak with someone I've known for many years, and today is one such time. I'm quite happy to speak with Attorney Robert Griffin, who has been, through much of my own career, the person you called first when your mission-driven organization got into some type of trouble. Today, we're going to discuss the reasons these organizations get into trouble in the first place, and then what they might actually do about it. Bob joined the Boston-based firm of Krokitis and Bluestein some 40 years ago and served as its managing partner until his retirement in 2021. His legal practice concentrated on healthcare, nonprofit, administrative, and corporate law. His clients included teaching and community hospitals, skilled nursing facilities, community health centers, senior living communities, community-based health service organizations, physicians, and allied health professionals. Earlier in his career, Bob held several positions in state government, including as chairman of the Massachusetts Rate Setting Commission. He has been recognized by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health for his work protecting residents of troubled nursing facilities, and he was recognized in the 2014 edition of The Best Lawyers in America. He serves on the boards of several nonprofit and community institutions and is also a graduate of Trinity College. Bob received his master's in public administration from the University of Massachusetts and his Juris Doctor degree from Suffolk Law School in Boston. Bob, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
Great to have you here. I gave listeners a pretty high-level overview of your background before hitting the record button here, but would you mind just telling us a little bit about your work, your career, and, in light of the topic we're going to talk about, when nonprofits get into trouble, how did you become an expert on that?
Well, it probably all started with my employment with state governments going back as far as 1976. For 9 years, I worked in a variety of departments, agencies that provided services to consumers that needed, behavioral health, disability services, health services. So I ended up working for agencies that had contracts with those organizations. And I ended my government career ahead of the Rate Setting Commission, where we established rates for all those agencies. I went to law school at Knights, got my law degree in 1983, and I joined the law firm of Krokitis and Bluestein in 1985 and developed a practice centered on healthcare and nonprofit organizations based upon my government experience. I became more expert in it mainly through opportunities that were created or actually requested of me, first by the Attorney General's office. As early as 1986, they asked me to become receiver of a nonprofit organization providing disability services. At the time, it was called ICFMR, residential services. And from there, I became lawyer to a receiver of a behavioral health organization. I subsequently was named receiver of two other nonprofit organizations. I also was asked to be a management advisor. It was all by the Attorney General's office. And then I ended up representing a number of providers before the Attorney General's office that had issues surrounding their governance. And it was basically a way of for lack of a better term, cleaning up operations, cleaning up the board, had to remove boards. And the goal many times is really to preserve the nonprofit public charity and to really minimize publicity because adverse publicity is really death knell for many nonprofit organizations. And just for a point of reference, Ray, I want to point out that I will use the terms nonprofit and public charities interchangeably because my expertise is really in the public charity side, which is probably 99% of all nonprofits. There is a small category of nonprofits that are not public charities, but for the most part, the nonprofits in this state and those who deal with the Commonwealth are in fact public charities.
Got it. Okay. So you've been around a lot of these organizations that are in trouble, and the Attorney General became accustomed to dialing your phone number in these situations, it sounds like. So recognizing that this is a big question, I'll just ask it, which is, what are some of the reasons that these organizations get into trouble in the first place?
There's a variety of reasons, Ray. There's no one single reason. I mean, the first and probably obvious to listeners is, you know, public charities that engage in fraud or or have massive regulatory noncompliance that jeopardizes consumer or patient's care. I mean, that's for the most part sort of the exception I have found, but nevertheless, it does exist,
Mhm.
um, and it has to be dealt with appropriately. A second area, and probably a more common area, and one that falls short of out fraud, is self-dealing, and there's really a couple two categories in that. One is a category that I can't claim ownership of the term founderitis. Actually, David Spackman, who was in charge of public charities, developed that term when I worked with him, dealing with several organizations that had what we called founderitis. And just for you, Ray, and the listeners, what the way we viewed founderitis is it's a nonprofit, public charity that was organized by an individual, and the individual many times put his or her own assets on the line to start the company, which I always advise against doing. But back in the days, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of folks did that. And as such, they sort of felt like this was their nonprofit. They had a sense of ownership, entitlement to it as time went on. Um, and the other kind of founderitis is headed by someone who's like a charismatic leader who may not necessarily been a founder, but but ended up with many of the attributes associated with the founderitis. Became a long-standing CEO, had a board that was disengaged, not overseeing the charity properly. So the end result of founderitis, whether you call someone who founded the organization or charismatic leader, is that unfortunately these individuals looked at the organization somewhat as their piggy bank. They could draw upon some of the financial reserves for their own use for certain items. They overcompensated themselves. They potentially got involved with giving certain perks to family members. So in the whole, it was basically just like a failure for there to be any kind of governance control by the board, and just the the charisma of a founder, just dictated where the organization was going. Another area is just mismanagement and insolvency, and this is where the board is just really sort of asleep at the switch, really not um, dealing with financial matters, or even with compliance issues, just sort of going along for the ride, so to speak, and the organization falls into disarray. You also have another area, what I would call market and demographic shifts. This is a little more complicated in that you could have boards that are fully engaged and being involved with governance and supervising the CEO and everything. But there could be regulatory changes that changes the delivery of services. The charity is really not attuned with those changes. You could have, what I call predatory competitors. You see that clearly in the hospital area, where large hospital systems are able to act in a predatory manner, and it leaves some of the less strong hospital systems or hospitals in jeopardy. There's also the um, failed confidence of consumers. This is where it goes to the publicity issue. You have a bad outcome and you can't manage it properly. This is where obviously public relations is important. You lose consumer confidence, and therefore the charity suffers in terms of volume or participation by the community. And lastly, there's also this, I see an emerging area of loss of workforce with the demographic changes and the gentrification. There are certain pockets in cities that used to be where the workforce came from, all of a sudden now has been so-called yuppified, but there's no longer that pool of employees, so you're unable to really staff up appropriately to meet the needs of the community. So you end up have to either relocate or shut down your operation. And lastly, there's an area, a change in corporate focus. And again, this is where a public charity has a certain mission statement, 50 plus years ago, and all of a sudden through contracting and whatever, they're shifting their mission, and what they have to do is that they don't properly redirect themselves. They could end up, you know, chasing themselves, trying to fulfill the old mission and trying to deal with the new mission. And that in that instance, I found nonprofits or public charities are able to separate out sort of the changed mission and give it to someone else or just to close it down. So that's sort of a overview. What I see is like 5 areas of problems.
Okay, that's great. That is a very helpful framework by which we can have the conversation, Bob. I'm drawn to think about the founderitis as you described it. I've, sometimes refer to it as founders syndrome, same exact thing in my own work, and oftentimes find that sometimes someone who may be suffering from this syndrome, when the environment changes, when things happen, when there are shifts in the environment, for example, or in the broader market, sometimes they may struggle to adapt because they're so vested in whatever it is that they built in the first place. And also, when the time comes for there to become the conversation of transition to the next leader, for whatever reason, sometimes it's just because the person who was in that original spot is nearing a retirement age or something. That can become very difficult because sometimes that person is struggling with issues of identity and legacy and even mortality, and it can get very personal very fast, and that can get quite awkward for boards.
Okay, Ray, you're spot on that. I mean, there's the legacy issue is very important. Letting go is difficult. I also find in founderitis cases, there tends to be overcompensation because there's not independent compensation analysis. It's sort of like, I'm worth what I'm worth, which is a lot more than what the market may necessarily bear. And it was also, I would say, a concern about founderitis and board members is that you'll find that they could be subject to, key time or whistleblowing, because sometimes employees get frustrated by looking at someone who they feel is not necessarily acting in the best interest of the organization. They may be acting in that person's best interest, and they may be cutting corners in certain areas. And I have been involved with resolving founderitis cases with the Attorney General's office and other enforcement agencies, including the U.S. Attorney's Office, as a result of whistleblowing in key time. So that's clearly a, a warning for boards, if you're not staying on top of the situation and trying to curtail, certain founder-rightist tendencies, you could be going down a real bad path.
Well, this issue of overcompensation also can just sometimes be, from the board's perspective, that the identity of that individual and the identity of the organization are so intertwined that they can't imagine what would happen without that person. And they may be quite fearful that that person will leave. And so overcompensation can be the result of just wanting to try to lock that person in as much as possible so that they don't have to go through a transition that they may be quite concerned could at some point happen.
Mhm.
You mentioned governance. You described the notion of governance being asleep at the switch, and you talked about times when the Attorney General asked you to step in into a receiver role, and you had to, I think you used the term clean up. So let's talk a little bit about the board of directors, the nonprofit governance. Um, can you talk about the characteristics of good governance? What's best practices here?
Okay, I think what I like to do when I discuss this is to point people to guides to provide information on how to practice good governance. And the guide that I usually refer to is the one that the Attorney General's office puts out. And the most recent version is in 2022. And it's really just to guide to public charities, to boards. And also included at the end of that guide is a list of other resources, including the IRS, which is important. And let me just sort of summarize the way that the Attorney General's General Office spells out good governance principles, and we can sort of see how maybe in certain instances we've talked about how those principles were not adhered to. I mean, first, the AG suggests know your responsibilities, okay? Your duty of care, your duty of loyalty, your fiduciary responsibilities. Your duty of care is for the prudent man rule. What would a reasonable person do in a given situation? Duty of loyalty, you're loyal to your public charity. You're not self-dealing. We talked about that earlier, the problems of self-dealing. And also participate in meetings and keep informed. That's so, sort of the asleep at the switch. Just don't go along for the ride. Be involved. Now, the other attribute of good governance is educate. Educate yourself as board members. Know your governing documents. Understand your role. We just did, discuss that in terms of participation, duty of care, duty of loyalty. Third, you have a right to information as a board member. And that includes just not information that is, given to you, by the organization. For example, excuse me, if you feel the need as a board member to get outside information, the board should be able and willing to hire consultants to advise them in the field. If they just, the market's changing, demographics are changing. We don't know what to do. Well, we need to bring a consultant in because maybe our organization isn't adept at being able to answering those questions. Pay close attention to financials. I can't underscore this enough.
Mm.
I've been asked to come in because of a financial free fall, a lot of times caused by founderitis, caused by boards that were not fully engaged. And it's just you got to understand the financials. Now, I'm not suggesting that you sit there at a board meeting and try to sort through a balance sheet. I mean, it's not easy. And there's a lot of numbers. And I have found in my own role, which I failed to mention at the beginning, I've been on many, many boards over the years, and I once calculated over 170 board years.
Mm.
I sat through
Mm. Oh.
financial statement reviews to actually become chair of finance. And I just find that a lot of the presentations just can overwhelm directors and they sort of get lost. But I strongly recommend that you understand certain financial ratios, particularly your current ratio and your days cash on hand, because you got to know those because you're going to find out whether you're going to exist or not. It's nice to know debt to service, debt to equity ratios, all that other stuff, but that gets confusing. And, I think you got to know where you stand on a given day, and you also have to make sure you have enough money to dispose of your obligations, and in particular, your wages to employees, because it is a crime in Massachusetts not to pay your employees. So you don't want to be left short and not have your employees paid. And the other piece that I strongly recommend in the financial area, it can be awkward, is when the finance committee hires independent auditor and has the review with management and the auditor. They ask management to leave the room. So the finance committee, only board members,
Hmm.
no staff, get to engage with the auditor in a totally transparent and honest assessment of what their view of management slash financial responsibility and actions have been. And that's where you'll find out if they can be more transparent. For example, they can tell you that, yeah, your controller is weak. Your CFO is good in a lot of areas, but weak in this area. They don't want to say that in front of them,
Right.
but they will tell the board that. And that's how you, as a board, can really get a handle on your financial situation is through independent discussions with the CPA. If you're a board member and the CEO or CFO pushes back on that, that's obviously a warning sign.
Yeah, it's a red flag for sure.
So you really stay on top of your financial situation, make sure there's internal controls, so forth. You need to have a diverse board.
Hmm.
Now, you go back to really early AG case involving a hospital system back in the 90s. They got involved and entered into agreement with AG because there was a closed club. There was community and people on the board was basically the country club clique. It was not representing the community, and there were some bad deals that happened. So the AG got involved and said, open up the board. Now, obviously, you need to have demographic representation with respect to various groups that either serve or the community you serve. You know, an area that I'm very involved with, and I'm on a board of a community health center, Ray, as you know, because uh, you help us. We have a requirement for a diverse board under uh, federal guidelines. You have to at least have 51% consumers, and then you need to have a diverse board. Now that's the extreme because it's federally required, but for public charities, they don't have a requirement. I can't underscore the importance of having a diverse board to get the viewpoints that are necessary so that the charity can properly represent the community, serve the consumers. The board members become the voice of the community to make sure that management understands fully what is going on in the community. Another area is um, with respect to the CEO. The board members have to be all involved with hiring the CEO. Don't delegate to a committee. You all have to be invested in who that CEO is. You don't want a situation where you have a small clique, hire the CEO, and the other members of the board feel disenfranchised. And of course, they're going to be questioning that CEO throughout his or her tenure. Being involved and following up on the CEO, make sure you're involved with the compensation of the CEO. Everyone should be involved with that. Should not be the finance committee, executive committee, and you should get comparables. And this would also help in the situation of founderitis, is that just because someone founded the organization doesn't mean it's bad, but you want to make sure that you have the proper protection with respect to compensation. Get yourself comp studies. It also will inoculate you from challenges from the IRS under the excess benefit transaction rules, which briefly says that if you as a board overcompensate or overpay someone, you can be held liable for a certain amount of penalties. I don't think there's necessarily prison time involved, but the point is you can be fined. You don't want that. Or the AG will come in and oversee you and also force you to realign yourself. And then last and very important area is make sure you avoid conflict of interest or you document transactions with related parties. A related party is a board member, is a family member of a key individual. I'm not saying that those transactions per se are bad, and sometimes you get better deals, but document them.
Mhm.
You have to document them. I found over time, insurance is like a key area. Someone gets on the board who's somehow involved with insurance, and they immediately want the charity to hire his insurance company or hire him as the agent, whatever the case may be. Do comps, cover yourself. You'll find you'll probably get a better deal, but if you don't do it, it's gonna, people are gonna raise issues with you. Similarly on any other kind of services. And also, when it comes to CEO compensation, I strongly recommend that anyone that does have a related party transaction with the organization, whether it be, a cleaning company or whatever you want to call it, the person who the transaction is with, the board member, should not be involved with establishing compensation for the CEO.
Right.
You want to avoid that quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I scratch your back. Just stay away from that. Isolate them. These are awkward conversations. I've had to do them in my practice, and sometimes it works, and sometimes I leave. I used to leave the engagement, or they would go venue shopping.
Mm.
But conflict of interest, avoid them at all costs. If you are going to do a related party, make sure there's not a conflict of interest by getting comp studies.
Great. Great list. Very, very comprehensive, Bob. Thank you for that. I will say I work with a number of nonprofit boards, and as you ticked through that list, I was just struck by the fact that there's still a fair bit of variability in this regard. And I work with a number of boards. You mentioned, the one that I would put as, the benchmark in this regard and following these guidelines quite well. But I do work with other organizations that are, uh, I guess, adhering much less rigorously to them. The document that you mentioned at the Massachusetts Attorney General, I'm familiar with that, and I think it provides a lot of good general information. Um, I can put a link to that in the show notes, but I just want to ask you as an attorney, is it so Massachusetts specific as to not be helpful to folks outside of Massachusetts, or are there some elements to it that are specific to Mass law?
No, that's pretty much as that would cover most jurisdictions. I do have to qualify that I'm a retired attorney now, so I
Gotcha.
not rendering any legal advice, just giving advice based on my experience. But that list should cover any kind of a public charity in any other jurisdiction because these are issues that the IRS would obviously be interested in, to the extent if they think there's overcompensation. But with the Attorney General Guide, there is a link to the IRS, which obviously covers all the jurisdictions. So I think it's a useful guide even if you're not in Massachusetts.
Okay, great. You know, Folks who listen to this podcast are leaders, board members, supporters of organizations that are much like the one you just described in terms of their mission, in terms of their focus, and so forth. And I just said there's a lot of variability. So if you are someone listening to this, and as you ticked through that list, someone hears this and thinks, "Oh, that part sounds familiar. This maybe is something of concern." Maybe they're part of an organization where they sense there could be some trouble, could be some decline. What do they then do? What advice do you have for them? Not legal advice, but sort of general advice in terms of what they might be able to do in order to turn the tide of their organization?
Right, let me just run down the list in terms of severity to less severe.
Hmm.
Obviously, the most severe case is if the Attorney General's office or the U.S. Attorney's office gets involved. And I've been involved with a number of those cases. And my recommendation in that case is the instance is if you get the U.S. Attorney's office involved, mainly due to a complaint, key time is where a lot of it comes from.
Mm,
You best hire yourself a former U.S. attorney to
gotcha.
represent you. I mean, I have found that, the open doors that we don't even know exist. They
Mm-hmm.
know the whole process. So unfortunately, you have to lawyer up in that kind of a situation. And similarly with the Attorney General's office, someone that understands laws and public charities, if it's public charities that comes after you, it's generally public charities. I have not found AG criminal that much involved with public charities. It's usually public charities oversight, which is a civil, which they can refer over to criminal if they feel necessary. So you really do have to lawyer up in that instance, and just because you just want to protect the reputation of the organization, the reputation of the board members, and many times these issues get resolved without much fanfare. But you just have to be on top of the situation. You can't mess around. I can't underscore that enough. Now, the area and the largest area is where I would call just sloppy practices, conflict of interest. We've talked about, shifts in corporate mission, founderitis, that whole bucket there is a large bucket. And I think the way you navigate that is is that you need to bring outside resources. And clearly you have to bring an attorney in that understands public charities so they can help in the extent you to buttress or redesign your corporate documents, tighten procedures, but you also need to bring in a consultant that is well versed in nonprofit public charities. They can help deal with the organizational structure as well as to deal with market changes, demographic changes. You want someone well versed, put my plug in for you, Ray, because I know you've been helpful to nonprofits, including some that I've been associated with. So you need someone that knows what they're doing in that area. And it's more than just, yeah, I think organizational flow. I think someone needs to understand the whole market dynamic as well. It's a well-versed type of consultant. And then, if if you're just things are going along hummingly and you feel like we're doing well, I still recommend that organizations should do what I call a corporate or organizational refresh, and that's really more uh, work for a consultant such as someone like you, Ray, that would help guide the board into, like, call it the new frontier. What opportunities are there? What opportunities maybe should we have not go to? Engage the board in some strategic planning. And I think if you do the corporate refresh, you might not deal with some of the above two issues of clearly, the fraud piece, non-compliance piece, or even the sloppy procedures, because a corporate refresh would just help guide the organization into the future. And that's, protects the charity
Hmm.
from, going down the wrong path. So that's how I would recommend, board members, if you're either in a bad situation, sense you may be in a bad situation, or even if you're in a good situation, be proactive. Don't wait for the bad situation before you bring in advisors.
I like that term, corporate refresh. I've done some work with a number of organizations going through a strategic planning process that want to incorporate that in. It's the proverbial, look in the mirror, get some external feedback, talk to folks internally, and be willing to listen. And you can uncover a lot. You can understand yourself and your situation pretty well when you do that. Not every organization does that. I certainly recommend it. So I like that term, though, refresh. We've been talking, Bob, about nonprofits. I know that's been an important part of your career, certainly a part of my focus. But um, let's just touch base a bit on the for-profit side of this. Before we get into the for-profit versus nonprofit and, what's happening in the broader state of healthcare, maybe you could just talk a bit about the kinds of trouble, because, much of what you've described, charitable organizations, nonprofits, and so forth, but the for-profits, what are the sorts of things that can go sideways for them?
Well, clearly for-profit is a hot button issue, always has been within healthcare. And I
Mhm,
should, you know, underscore that I have represented for-profit healthcare.
mhm,
I've acted as receiver of many nursing homes on behalf of the Attorney General's office, all for-profit. So I've seen what can get, for-profits into trouble. And in many respects, it's really no different than nonprofits, except it's can be how's the right way to it can be more readily occur in the for-profit world.
mhm,
And the way I look at it with for-profits is that there's really the tension in for-profits is between accountability and independence, where it's clear in charities, public charities are for the public good, and for-profits are driven by profits. And it depends upon how aggressive a for-profit is in pursuing profits and at the expense of whom. Now, let me just talk about categories of for-profits and problems that may ensue from them, because not all for-profits are bad. For example, you have, let's call it the lower entry level for-profit, private practitioners, whether it be physicians, your physical therapist, home care agencies. They many of them are for profit, right? And I view them as being people that tend to be more sensitive to the community in which they live in, because they tend to be more localized, and they're going to feel some of the community pressures if they act inappropriately. They're also smaller scale, not searching for the big profits. That also includes mom and pop nursing homes, which sort of disappeared, but that used to be a phenomenon we had here. The other extreme is private equity, where, let's face it, I mean, at the end of the day, their primary concern is return on investment. So their corporate mission is far different than even a small nonprofit provider. How do you get in trouble? Obviously, excessive profiteering. So it's really it's been well documented time and time again. You just pick up the newspapers. You have to look at Massachusetts, you look at Rhode Island, some of the damage that private equity can do because the way the money gets pulled out. And in the middle, you have publicly traded companies. Now they're a little different in that they do have some some more accountability than private equity, in that they have shareholders. You have the SEC. They're not they're not going to go and rip large sums of money out of organizations, because they have to, appease the shareholders, and they have to appease their mission. The problem that I see sometimes that can happen within even a large for-profit and even a smaller nonprofit is that, particularly, a large for-profit is publicly traded, is sometimes the pressure for shareholder return can be such that people may cut corners and you run into compliance issues. You see some major paybacks to government because of aggressive, upcoding, whatever the case may be. It doesn't say that nonprofits don't have the same issue, But at the end of the day, when the nonprofits get their money, it's ultimately, for public charity and for public good. For-profit world either goes to shareholders, or if it's private equity, it goes to investors. So that's how I sort of look at the for-profit scene, is by those three different categories. And I have not found, when I've been receiver, I have been receiver of nursing homes that were smaller, family owned, that ran amok. And
Mhm.
basically it's just greed.
Oh,
They didn't pay the IRS, they took the money, did bad things with it. And in those cases, there's no independent accountability. And that's, to me, the problem with many for-profit healthcare is what is the extent to which there's accountability by an independent group. In a nonprofit public charity, if a board is acting properly, that is, because we talked about some of the problems, but if a board is doing its job, there is independence, there's accountability, and it's for the public good. In a for-profit, if there is independent accountability, you're going to have good services and so forth. But when you're closely held, there's not much independence. So really, the accountability is your relationship with the community and your consumers. But if your ultimate goal is to pocket as much money as you can, then your interest in community sort of wanes. And that's sort of the horns of the dilemma in the for-profit world, is when does the profit motive overtake what's best for the community?
right. Well, you described that this has always been a hot button in healthcare, and in the geographic area where we live, this has been particularly hot more recently because of the high profile collapse of a major for-profit hospital chain, which has been on the minds of lots of folks as we've witnessed what that looks like, and what that does to the healthcare industry, to patients, employees, that sort of thing. But there has been an increase in the presence of for-profit organizations in the healthcare industry. Some segments, like hospice and home care, and others, more so than in other parts of the system. Care to share your thoughts, from a policy perspective, from a bigger picture, panoramic view perspective, what you think this is doing to our industry?
Well, for-profit healthcare is sometimes the last resort for providers, in particular hospitals. A hospital that is, for whatever reason, we can go back to the list of the five problem areas, whether it's lack of financial oversight, changing demographics. There's a whole host of reasons why a public charity that is a hospital is failing, and no other public charity hospital wants to be involved. It's the for-profits that come in to save the hospital.
Mm,
And from my point of view, I guess, that's a good,
mm,
but then you have to then monitor what happens to that for-profit hospital. Now, there's certain, hospital chains, for lack of a better name, that have been highly successful, in taking over hospitals like that, and have been around for 20, 30 years, publicly traded. I think from that perspective, they're a good,
mm,
because hospitals would not otherwise exist. I think the problem is that when there's hospitals that are not taken over by publicly traded, they're into this private equity piece, and everyone acknowledges, whether it's reports in Massachusetts, Rhode Island's going through the same thing. The Attorney General in Rhode Island put a report out that simply said, private equity is there to pull money out. It's not a surprise, right?
mm,
And I think so. You track what happens, 10 years later, and then it raises the policy question: is the amount of money that government has to put in to bail out organizations, should they have just done that 10 years ago? That's easy to say, in terms of, armchair quarterbacking, but you know, that's an issue in terms of when for-profit does take over a hospital. I think it was, what is the structure of the for-profit? What is really their commitment? So I'm not saying all for-profit is bad. In some
mm,
cases, it's good. Now, in terms of the other areas, hospice, home care, competing with nonprofits. I mean, home care probably provide certain efficiencies, and providing that they meet all the regulatory requirements. I I don't see a problem with that. Same with, physicians, they're for profits,
Mhm.
so I just think it really turns on what is again, it comes down to balancing the profit incentive with meeting regulatory requirements and also basically self-dealing, how much money is someone pulling out?
Okay. Good. It's a good balanced view, and it is worth remembering that sometimes these organizations don't have other choices, and the for-profits will come in and will continue the mission, the original mission of that organization off into the future when there were no other possibilities. So yeah, good balanced view. Bob, this has been most helpful. This has been a very, very good, I think, overview, and I would dare say probably be a good training resource for leaders and members of nonprofit boards. Um,
If people have questions on anything that we discussed, including my hobbies, feel free to send me an email.
Thanks for listening. I hope you'll consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your platform of choice. That will help others find us here. My mission is to help empower organizations that matter by supporting those who lead them. Feel free to learn more about me and my work at redsaleadvisors.com.